One of the things that has concerned me over the years, especially as we began looking at this particular study, is our denomination's ability to reach people of various ethnic backgrounds who now live throughout our communities in the city or the suburbs. They're moving in. We can't get away from the browning of America. And to tell you the truth, there have been people here for a very long time since the beginning, whether it be Native Americans or the African Americans who came here through the transatlantic slave trade, and of course then many minorities who've immigrated to this country. How do we reach them? And this is a real concern of mine, because I think that when we think about how to reach them, it really does call for us to pick up our crosses. One of the things that Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, I think is very helpful, and I think we should do a really good job of studying this particular chapter to really understand how we can go about reaching people who are different from ourselves, especially from the dominant culture in the PCA. Paul says, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of Christ, but under the law of Christ. Not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel." When I look at that passage, and I've had privilege of traveling to different PCA churches and talking about this issue from this passage, how do we reach people in our communities, in particular, since we're talking about the PCA, who are not white? How do we do it? Well, Paul gives us, that whole chapter, he gives us the blueprint for doing it. What he says, even before the passage I just read, was that he gave up his rights. Paul had the right to financial support from the various churches that he served, but he chose not to capitalize on those rights. It seems there might have been some confusion. There might have been some people who thought they could control Paul through their financial giving. We've never heard of that before, I'm sure. But Paul decided not to accept their money, which was his right to do so. As one preaching the gospel, he had the right to financial support, but he didn't do it so that he could preach the gospel freely. And then he launches into this statement, which I just read. He makes the point that he wants to become all things to all people, that he might win some. He talks about the fact that he accommodated himself. He did not change the message. He never let go of the gospel in any way, shape, or form. But he accommodated himself to the people to whom he was ministering, whether they be Jews like himself. By the way, he never stopped being a Jew. He knew who he was ethnically. He embraced his ethnicity. But in order to win people, he didn't make that the leading point, the starting point. He didn't make people become a Jew. We see this in the book of Acts as well, and to become a Jew in order to become a Christian. So what Paul did was accommodate himself to the people he was talking to. To those outside the law, the Gentiles, he became as though he identified with them. I think what Paul was doing was recognizing the image of God in all people. And so he could accommodate himself to the Gentile, to the weak. He became weak. He did all these things, he says, to win them. He didn't stand upon his ethnic rights. He didn't stand upon his ethnic identity to make that the standard for which they must accommodate themselves. But no, for the sake of the gospel, Paul accommodated himself in order to reach people who were not like himself. Paul was not a Gentile. Paul was not weak. And by weak in this passage, I really think he's talking about what the Bible describes as weak. Those who, the widow, the orphan, the immigrant. Those are the weak in society. Those who are poor. Those who are at risk in society because they have no influence, no power, no strength. They are the weak. Paul says he identified with them as well. Why? Because they were made in the image of God. And when they came to Jesus, they became those who were recreated in the image of Christ. So Paul reached out to them in a way that allowed them to be who they were without having to change in that regards. Here's my concern. within the PCA, and I love my denomination, this is my family. I am going nowhere. I've been in the PCA since 1990, almost 30 years. If I was going to leave, I would have left a long time ago. The PCA is my family. Whatever color, whatever flavor you happen to be, you belong to me and I belong to you. I am honored to be part of this denomination. However, I am afraid that some of our churches are asking a different question. They're not asking, how can we reach them? How can we reach them with the gospel? How can we become all things to all people that we might win them? They're not asking that question. They're asking this question. How can we reach them without changing? And the answer to that question is you can't. You can't reach people who are not like yourself without some change. Now again, notice Paul did not give up his ethnic identity. He did not, in order to reach non-Jews, he didn't become a non-Jew. Listen, when I joined the PCA, I didn't become white. But I accommodated myself to this denomination, and in some cases, this denomination accommodated itself to me. We never let go of the truth of the gospel. We never changed the message. But will we allow people to be who they've been created in the image of God? Will we allow them to be themselves? Will we embrace that image in our churches? Will we make some accommodation in order to win them to Christ? Or are we going to do what I'm afraid that so many of our churches have done, is that in order to become a part of a PCA church, you really have to become white. Now, that's really not possible unless you do great violence to who you are as the image of God, as an African American, as an Asian American, as a Latino American, whoever you might be. You have to do great damage to your own self and your own identity many times to join a PCA church, because who you are as the image of God is not welcome. What you'll find out, and again, this is probably controversial and some would disagree with me, but what you'll find out, even in PCA churches where there are different ethnic groups present, what you will find in that church is that the dominant culture of that church, the dominant feel of that church, really doesn't embrace the identity of all the people. It's very dynamically white. So that's expressed in our worship. That's expressed in the issues that we talk about, even from the pulpit. Even though we're preaching the Bible, how we apply the Bible can be broadened, but it's often not. It's not taken into consideration that we have people in this congregation who are from African American descent or from Asian descent, and they're thinking and dealing with issues in their culture that don't truly reflect what's happening in the dominant white culture. And if we don't learn to actually bring the gospel to bear on those issues, then what happens is we're telling these people, you can join our church, but you've got to look and think like us. Now, we can't look like white people, but we certainly can begin to be seen. I'm kind of concerned when people say, I don't see color. I don't see race. You know who says that? White people. You know, ask a minority person. We never say that. We never say we don't see race. We're not ashamed of who we are. My white brethren, I know what you're thinking. You're seeking, and I applaud this. The desire is not to be racist. You're seeking not to be prejudiced. So therefore, you think by saying I don't see color, that keeps me from being prejudiced. And it really actually works in the reverse. By saying you don't see color, you don't see race, what you're saying to me is you don't see me. You're saying to me that who God has made me ethnically somehow is I should be ashamed of, or you should be ashamed of, somebody should be ashamed of. And really what that does is just make me feel very uncomfortable around you. Paul saw race. He recognized who the Gentiles were. He recognized that he was a Jew. He talks about how he went, when Jewish culture, he behaved a certain way. When he was interacting with Gentiles, he brought the gospel to them in a certain way, understanding who they were. He did it in the book of Acts when he went to the Athenians and he's preaching the gospel on Mars Hill. He actually knew their poets. He quoted their poets. He understood their culture. What Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians 9 is what it really means to be a missionary. That's who Paul was. As an apostle, he was the chief of missionaries. And here's the thing about the PCA, which is so applaudable. When we send people to the mission field, MTW, which is a great organization, when we send people to the mission field, we make sure we train them in the language, the culture, the dress, the ideas of the people that they're going to minister to. We also make sure they have a love for that culture, because if they don't have a love for the culture they're going to go in a very paternalistic way. I'm here to save you. So we make sure they're trained in all of these things so that when they go to that culture, they have a healthy appreciation, I believe, for the imago Dei in that culture, and for what the gospel maybe has already done in that culture, possibly. Maybe how God has prepared this culture for the gospel, but they go with an appreciation and they go learned. Here's the problem. We don't do that in our own culture here. We don't do that in our own country. We don't do that in our own communities. We don't know the people groups in our own communities. We made the mistake of thinking that if they all speak Spanish, they all must be the same. Huge mistake. When I was living in Washington, D.C., we were looking at planting a church there some years ago, and I remember going to a meeting of Latino people in that city. And what I learned was that there is actually a hierarchy in Latino culture that they themselves recognize. That the Cubans are not the same as the Puerto Ricans, and the Puerto Ricans are not the same as the Mexicans, and that there is even some competition among them, though they all speak the same Spanish language. They're not the same. When I was living in Miami and pastoring a PCA church there, whenever I saw a black person, I had to stop and ask questions, because my general thinking would be, he's an African American. And many times the person was not African American at all. The person was Cuban, Caribbean, from Jamaica, or any of the Cuban of the West Indian islands, or it could have been or Haitian or whatever. This person, because they were black, they could have been anybody and have a different history. Do we know the people in our communities? Are we doing good missionary work? Are we getting to know them, not just by reading books, though we should read books, I'm all for that, but are we talking to them, learning their history, learning what they love, learning their art, understand and appreciating these things, because we recognize, though fallen, that the image of God exists equally in all ethnic cultures. Equally. No one culture has more of the imago Dei than any other. And therefore, but also the gospel says that all cultures are also equally fallen. No culture is more fallen than any others. There's no such thing as a supreme culture. White supremacy in this country is a great sin, a huge sin that needs to be repudiated by all who believe in Jesus. But so with black supremacy. If, as an African American, if I believe that I was supreme over my white brothers or my Latino brothers, that too, horrid, false teaching that needs to be repudiated, and understand that we're all equally fallen. We're all equally image bearers. We all equally need Jesus so desperately. But will we in the PCA seek to reach these cultures by becoming all things to all people? You don't have to become black to reach African American people. No. But you can identify with me as a person created in the image of God, living in this country with a particular history that is different from my African brothers coming over here from, say, Kenya. Different history. Will you learn of what it means, as best as you can, what it means to be an African American in this country? What's happening in the community where your church is located and where I live? What's happening in that community? What's the history of your church in particular as it deals with minorities in that culture? You have a history. If you've been there for any length of time, your church has a history. What is that history? Is it favorable? Is it unfavorable? What do you know about the people you're trying to reach with the gospel? Will you take the time? Will you take the time to say, we're gonna seek to reach you, and we're gonna embrace the Imago Dei in your culture. And we're gonna bring that culture into our church. We're gonna welcome who you are into our congregation. Not sin, no, not sin, but welcome that image. Learn of that image. What is it about, say, in your community? Maybe you have Guatemalan immigrants moving in. We have the same thing happening in Chattanooga in particular. We're seeking to learn more about Guatemalan community, about who they are as a people. Why did they come to this community? Why Chattanooga of all places? What are their fears and hopes and dreams as they have come into this community? That's how we seek to bring the gospel to them. And as they come into our congregation, we accommodate ourselves in a healthy way to welcome their culture into our community, into our church community. So that might mean that we sing songs in Spanish. We actually put the words up in English because I don't speak Spanish very well. So we put the words up in English too. When we have community dinners, we make sure they bring their culture into our church. We don't expect them to do everything the way we do it. When we think about issues in our community, we're thinking about issues not just from our church is predominantly, actually New City is predominantly Caucasian in makeup, though there's a larger growing group of African Americans in our church from the very beginning, because that was the culture we were trying to reach. And so when you come into our church, you'll see you'll see music that reflects the identity of African Americans, but not only because we're not an African American church. We are a Presbyterian church seeking to reach various groups in our community. So you're going to see in our church people expressing themselves in worship in different ways. You'll see my white brethren, some standing there and just mouth the words there. You don't see the hands don't go up. But they're singing. You'll see African American and other minorities lifting their hands and worshiping God right alongside that person. Do we look at that person strange because are they welcome? Do they feel that they're welcome? When you come in a new city, what you'll find is that up front, when you look up front, you'll see a variety of people, because we want people to know that this church welcomes who you are as the image of God. The issues we deal with from the pulpit on occasion, many times, will be reflective, not just of, say, a white, middle-class, Republican type of background, though we do address such issues from that perspective. But no, we'll be talking about issues that are reflective of the African American community in our area, or maybe even of the Guatemalan community as they're coming in. Does your church welcome people? I'm certainly not asking anyone to give up their biblically held convictions. But some of the things we call biblically held convictions really are ethnic, cultural conditions that should not control how we reach people with the gospel. They should not be allowed to dominate. Do I have to become white to come to your church? Would I look strange in your congregation? Would I feel that this church cares nothing about who I am as a person because you don't address issues that concern this growing body of people who look like me in your community? Will you become all things to all people, that you might win some? Notice what Paul said, that I might win some. And notice what he said, I do it all for the sake of the gospel. What are you willing to do for the sake of the gospel? Sadly, what are you not willing to do for the sake of the gospel? Who are you? Are you the people of God? Are you a kingdom people? Or do you hold so tightly to your own ethnic identity that it has become a barrier to bringing the gospel to people in your own community who don't look like you? Not a sermon, just a thought. Amen.